Well, you've made it to heroic Queen Ansurek. The prize is right there, just within reach. Ahead of the curve is calling your name. The only thing standing in your way is a toxic queen and a totally respectable raid leader that will absolutely forgive you for missing that interrupt. In this guide, we're going to cover the fight for heroic Queen Ansurek. But before we get started, don't forget to tap that like and subscribe button to stay in the loop on future content. We've also just introduced a brand new members only club featuring emojis, badges, priority comments, insider videos, and much more. So let's get started. There are two things you'll want to collect if you're struggling with this encounter. One will help with your survivability and a damage buff to keep your raid team happy. The damage buff comes from a new bazaar at the entrance of the palace. This quest, called the Finer Things, requires 16 Nerub'ar finery. You can collect 8 of these per week from LFR, normal, heroic, or mythic bosses. Doing multiple tiers will not earn you more than 8 fineries per week, unless you're on catch-up. Once you turn these in, your entire warband will receive a 2.25% damage buff while inside Nerub'ar Palace. This effect stacks up to 8 times for a maximum of 18%. The second item you'll want to collect is the Vantis rune. Inscriptionists can make this, or you can buy it on the auction house. Using this will increase your versatility by 1500, 1700, or 1900 against the targeted raid boss for the remainder of the week. You can only have one Vantis rune active per week, so choose your target carefully. Alright, you're going to see these 6 panels around the room. The raid leader should have 2 of these panels marked according to where the ads will spawn after the intermission. These will always be in the same 2 locations, but your group may defer either to the ad next to the bridge or on the far side of the platform. As an example, if you're in groups 1 and 3 or an odd group, you'll be on a different side of the platform than if you're in groups 2 and 4. Each raid group might perform this encounter differently, but I'm going to cover the most common method that'll earn you a pass for pugging. The pre-assigned tank will want to pull the boss over to the outer panel just left of the bridge. After a few seconds, Ansurek is going to cast Liquefy. This will drop an acid puddle beneath Ansurek and derail the first tank for a significant amount of nature and physical damage. You've got to mitigate this. The second tank now needs to taunt Ansurek before she follows up with Feast, or to one-shot the liquefied tank. At the same time that Ansurek casts Liquefy on the opening tank, she will launch globs of acid at a number of random players, leaving behind a permanent acid pool on the ground. Non-tank players will want to move into a safe area behind Ansurek during Liquefy, which will keep the area open and ready for web blades, reactive toxins, and pathing for the feasted tank. The liquefied tank will be taking a massive damage increase for 30 seconds, while the feasted tank will take on the boss with a massive healing absorption. In either case, both tanks will need to use their defensives to mitigate the initial burst. The feasted tank and the healers will need to work together, both with self-heals and directed healing, to remove the absorption. While the tank is moving the boss is going to cast reactive toxins, followed up with web blades. Reactive toxins will spit globs of acid at 2 random players, causing them to erupt after 6 seconds. If these aren't managed or placed properly, the raid is going to get one-shotted by Ansurek's Poison Nova. Before the raid started, you'll likely have heard the raid leader calling out terms like inner and outer, and assigning 3 poppers for each. In this phase, both toxified players will need to carefully navigate the web blades and position themselves on both the left and right-hand sides of the boss. The left-hand side will be your inner circle, the right-hand side by the edge will be your outer circle. Your poppers are going to be the pre-assigned players who will briefly step into the middle of the froth pool right before the Poison Nova. They'll either be assigned as a 1, 2, or 3 for the designated froth pool. The triggering player will cause everyone in that pool to bounce over the Poison Nova. Once the triggering player lands, they'll need to run out of the raid group before they explode for raid-wide damage. Healers will want to focus these 2 players for the next 6 seconds after landing. Upon landing, the froth pools will detonate, dealing significant nature damage to any player within an 8-yard radius, and causes waves of poison to spew outward in all directions. Avoid those. If the Poison Nova collides with the froth pools at any point before they're popped, it's a wipe. Last up is Silken Tomb. This is a raid-wide route, leaving players 4 seconds to stack up and destroy the webbing before the web blades. Mind your distance, as the rooting will inflict nature damage to all players within a 2-yard radius of the burst. Once the root is destroyed, it will leave behind a permanent webbing on the ground. Don't stand in it. Now we just rinse and repeat these mechanics until the intermission. In the intermission phase, Ansurek will bind all players in the raid to a web, spewing out paralyzing waves and periodically yanking players towards the middle with rest. During this phase, Ansurek will cast Paralyzing Venom, which will progressively slow the raid group and increase the damage from the next rest by 33%. This effect stacks. Just before the yank, you'll want to utilize any speed burst to gain as much distance as you can from Ansurek. Your class may also have an ability to interrupt the yank, such as the Demon Hunter's Glide. Be careful not to get hit by the paralyzing waves during the yank, as this will also apply the paralyzing venom. If you touch the middle at any point during the intermission, it will kill you instantly. This phase will last until you break the shield protecting Ansurek, or the raid inevitably wipes. Once the shield has been broken, Ansurek will climb to the upper platform and begin casting Acidic Apocalypse. She'll then call 2 Void Speakers to opposite sides of the room. The raid will now need to split into 2 predetermined teams, likely referred to as odds and evens. You can help your raid team by marking the floor and placing an icon on the tank with the respective symbols before the encounter. The Void Speakers will always spawn where they need to be tanked and killed. The Void Speakers will frequently attempt to one-shot players with Shadow Blast. This must be interrupted. Players will also be randomly targeted by a Dark Swirly, which will eject dark orbs in all directions. Players will need to dodge that as well. Once the Void Speaker dies, it'll leave behind an impending Gloom Blast. Players will need to position themselves between the impending blast and the raised platforms to reach it. If you miss the blast, you're dead. Run in the opposite direction when Ansurek attempts to pull you off the platform with rest. Stacking on players during the pull will inflict predation threads, inflicting moderate nature damage to nearby players. Chamber Expellers on the raised platforms will cast Expulsion Beam, dealing massive shadow damage and attempting to knock you off. The Chamber Guardians will deal heavy damage to the tank while also attempting to knock players off with ousting fragments. Don't get hit by those. Once the adds have been defeated, you'll see 2 interactable obelisks on the side of the platform. Clicking on these will form a bridge and cause a group of caustic skitterers to appear. Let your tank grab these while the rest of the group heads for the next platform. Devoted worshippers will greet you on the next platform. You need to kill these before they wipe the raid with Cosmic Apocalypse. Gloom Touch will also apply a 12-second dot on multiple players that will burst shadow damage to everyone within 100 yards when it falls off. Spread out these dispels, activate the obelisks, have your tank pick up the skitterers, and move to the 3rd platform. The 3rd platform holds the final Void Speaker. Like before, players will be randomly targeted by Gloom Orbs. Don't stand in or get hit by those. Interrupt Shadow Blast every time to avoid players from getting one-shotted, then position yourself behind the eruption to be boosted up onto Ansurek's platform. This will automatically interrupt Acidic Apocalypse and begin Phase 3. Ansurek will start Phase 3 with Aphotic Communion. After 20 seconds, she will deal raid-wide shadow damage and receive a permanent buff called Dreadful Presence. This will deal pulsing shadow damage to the raid every 2 seconds and stacks each time an Abyssal Conduit opens. Use these 20 seconds to deal as much damage to Queen Ansurek as you can before Dreadful Presence takes effect. Once she lands, she will hit one of the tanks with Infest. That tank needs to run out of the raid. When Infest expires, it'll drop a group of Gloom Hatchlings, dealing a large amount of shadow damage to any player within 15 yards. Raid players will need to use any ability in their toolkit to keep these hatchlings from reaching the boss. Otherwise, they'll inflict raid-wide damage and give Ansurek a big damage buff. A shout out to the other tank here for mastering my complete absence of a taunt. While the first tank is inflicted with Infest, the other tank will be hit with Gorge, applying a big stacking debuff that increases their damage taken. Periodically, 2 players are going to be targeted by Abyssal Infusion. After 6 seconds, these players will explode, inflicting a knockback and dealing a large amount of shadow damage to all players within a 10-yard radius. Players will want to drop these both parallel on the inner edge and outer edge of the platform to navigate past the frothing gluttony that follows. Once both players have dropped their portals, orbs will eject in all directions and Ansurek will follow through with Frothing Gluttony. This will pull the raid towards the center, and just like the intermission, you need to run in the opposite direction in which you're being pulled, or you're dead. Additionally, you're going to see this massive Dark Nova approach. Your only way of getting around this Nova is by moving towards the inner portal, waiting for the Nova to pass the outer portal, then clicking on the inner portal to escape it. Crossing the portal will trigger a conduit collapse, leaving behind a permanent shadow pool on the ground. After exiting the portal, players will also receive Abyssal Reverberation, which is a giant raid bomb, so be ready to spread. Web Blades also return. Dodge those, and lastly, Royal Condemnation will drop big webs on 2 players. This will explode for raid-wide damage, reduced by the amount of distance. The burst will spawn a number of Royal Shackles. These will pull players in, applying a movement speed reduction by 10%. Players need to destroy these shackles without touching them. Again, this phase is a damage check. The more times she casts Frothing Gluttony, the more difficult this phase becomes, and eventually, she'll cast Cataclysmic as... Again, this phase is a damage check. The more times she casts Frothing Gluttony, the more difficult this phase becomes, and eventually, she'll cast Cataclysmic Evolution and one-shot the raid. And that's the Queen Ansurek encounter on Heroic difficulty. I hope you found this guide helpful in obtaining your AOTC. Let me know what strategies you have in defeating Queen Ansurek in the comments below. Until next time.